Gathered friends, you know why we're here. 2003 marked the end of a self-imposed trilogy for the BIONICLE franchise. With this, they were pulling all stops when it came to marketing.
It's McTootie, the Bionic Man.
Collectibles skyrocketed with the success LEGO was seeing, and sets and merchandise deals were raking in the money for them. To go along with the release of their direct-to-video film, BIONICLE Mask of Light the Movie, LEGO had one more ace up their sleeve. Something that I've been developing for 2 years as the must-have release for gaming in the BIONICLE fandom that would define a game company's legacy. This is the retrospective of BIONICLE, the game. Right off the bat, I find it incredibly bold that they took to calling it BIONICLE, the game. Like, they didn't quite know what would best describe the experience you're about to have, so they just settled with the game. After playing through this again, I don't blame them. It is, by textbook definition, a video game. For this retrospective, I decided to do a little more than just play through the game again. I'm giving a Reader's Digest on how this dumpster fire came to be. There was a lot while researching for this video that doesn't add up at all. The development history and its problems, the in-game story, and critical reception that would turn them off to making another main console game for BIONICLE for 3 years. And of course, this is one of the first times we witnessed the LEGO trademark of throwing out everything and starting over for reasons they never explained. This happened multiple times with just this one project over its 2.5 years of development hell. I'm going to go through the ins and outs of what made this smorgasbord of a game. So let's start with the out. What went on in our world to get this game onto shelves? Part 1. LEGO attempts to make video games and it only kind of worked. With LEGO's sleeper hit BIONICLE taking off as their lead cash cow in 2001, there was clearly a desire to capitalize on it. There was a financial rut that LEGO was in at the beginning of the century that plenty of people besides me have covered, so doing it here seems redundant. So what do you do when your franchise is suffering in the early 2000s? You make video games! The LEGO Group had recently started a wing for video game entertainment called LEGO Interactive. This wing partnered up with game developer Sapphire Corporation. Haven't heard of them? Me neither until I started researching for this. They were a small company in Utah and they seemed to be a middleman by helping with ports of already existing games or basic asset animation for big titles. They're like one of those dozens of companies you see in the credits of a Marvel movie. They worked on the Macintosh port of StarCraft Brood War, a couple of the early Tom Clancy games, and lots of other tie-in titles to existing properties. So they were no strangers to the cash cow mold. And even though they had to work on platforms like PC and the N64, a majority of their work was on handheld consoles, specifically the Game Boy. The LEGO Group approached them to develop 2 titles, BIONICLE Tales of the Tahunga and BIONICLE The Legend of Motunui. These games would cover the story of BIONICLE as it was told in 2001, with Legend of Motunui being the lead title, and Tales of the Tahunga being a midquel of sorts. Tales of the Tahunga would take place at the same time as The Legend of Motunui, just covering a different perspective. TLMN would be a 3D open-world platformer where you would play as the Toa going across the island of Motunui, finding the Kanohi masks across the island, and defeating the Makuta with their combined power. Both games were slated to be released in October 2001, The Legend of Motunui releasing on PC, and a GameCube release in spring 2002. They were also hoping to release it on PlayStation at some point. Sadly, as the release date for PC approached, the LEGO Group decided to pull the plug on The Legend of Motunui. There's not much of this game or the story behind its development that exists to really get why they cancelled the project. The only reasons LEGO publicly claimed for doing it was chip compatibility and timing. After the project was terminated, copies of what they completed were burned onto CDs and given to a handful of the developers. I'm assuming that was mostly for portfolios and demo reels. Tales of the Tahunga would release as planned for the Game Boy Advance later that year. Later copies of the game would retroactively have their title changed to BIONICLE Quest for the Toa. The LEGO Group got into trouble for using some Aboriginal words like Tahunga in BIONICLE media, but it's all semantics, it's not really the story for right now. The Legend of Motunui's development story is one for another time, but all of this was brought up for the fact that even since the beginning of the line, LEGO was wanting a flagship video game title for BIONICLE. Other projects like their website-based Motunui Online game were taking off, but they wanted to prove their status in the thriving business of home video games. The concept of TLMN was ambitious, but it feels like they bit off a bit more than they could chew. It wasn't the first time, and this next part wasn't even the last time. Immediately after canning The Legend of Motunui, the LEGO Group prepared once again for their next big project. After the lukewarm success of Tales of the Tahunga, LEGO Interactive poked the shoulder of Argonaut Games in October 2001 to, you guessed it, develop 2 new games. They moved on right away. A side-scrolling platformer for handheld, and a 3D platformer for major consoles. Why this pattern? I have no idea. Argonaut Games was a company with a slightly bigger reputation than Sapphire's. They took tie-in games and practically ran it into the ground. Argonaut's biggest claim to fame was their partnership with EA, who published a majority of their games. After helping develop Star Fox for the SNES in 1993, Argonaut developed games like Ren and Stimpy for the SNES, Scooby-Doo Mystery for the SNES, and most notably, the PlayStation 1 ports of the first two Harry Potter games.
As soon as I heard, I rushed down from my hut to give you a big congratulations. I know you'll catch the snitch first, I just know it.
My lord in heaven, what did they do to you? In 2002, BIONICLE Matoran Adventures was released for the Game Boy Advance. You play as the main Mictoran, as they've been nicknamed, fight through the island's Rahi, and eventually help the off-screen Toa fight and defeat the Bohrok. It sold reasonably well, kind of like Quest for the Toa before, and it seemed to be a good omen. EA hopped onto the development for the next BIONICLE game in early 2002, and the ball rolled from there. BIONICLE the game was officially announced a year later on May 2nd, 2003, with a scheduled release of fall 2003 to tie in with The Mask of Light coming out on DVD and video. But again, there's almost no information about the development of this game. Seriously, I even went onto IMDb Pro and got a subscription just so I could try to find information on the creators, and there's nothing there. The initial announcement was made with no supporting game footage or trailer. They basically just gave us empty platitudes. They promised we could play in each area of the island of Matanui as the 6 Toa in their original Mata forms. Then you would evolve into the Toa Nuva after completing each of their stories and play as them again in the Nuva forms. A mysterious 7th Toa, that was not Voriki, would become the Toa of Light, and the supposed 13th level would have you fight and defeat Makuta in his ultimate form. For you younger folk, do you remember when Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 4 was cancelled in 2011? But it was okay because this random new Spider-Man was going to help the Avengers fight Thanos in 10 years? Which, yes, that all did happen, but how many of us would have believed that all the way back in 2008? That was the explanation of this game. E3 2003 was 2 weeks after this announcement. Here, EA had a trailer with comparison clips between in-game models and the toys, as well as pre-rendered cutscenes. The trailer had some test footage where you could clearly tell from the user interface that they were still working out the kinks. The footage also included some examples of the level for Lewa Mata. All of this looked promising, but everything presented at E3 2003 was, in my opinion, borderline criminal. What follows would take false advertising to the next level. The Game Boy Advance port of BIONICLE the game was released on September 10th, 2003, 3 days before Mask of Light came out. They barely made that deadline. The official game was released on Xbox, PS2, and GameCube on October 20th, and the PC port was released a week after that. The resulting product was a mess. The level count we were promised was cut from 13 to 8. The weirdest part of that change was the Lewa Mata level from the demo was completely scrapped. The playable Toa Mata were obviously cut down to just Tahu and Kopaka. The Toa Nuva were cut to Gali, Pohatu, Onua, Lewa, and Tahu again. Sorry, Kopaka. Lastly, Takua Nuva served as the 8th level. He still battled the Makuta and brought this game to its conclusion. The reviews of this game were disastrous. IGN gave it a 3.8 out of 10, critiquing its pacing, graphics, and blaming the counterintuitive levels on the poor camera controls and overall bad functionality. They did make note of very small things they liked, such as the animation for recharging your elemental energy. Really grasping at straws here, aren't we? To sum it up, LEGO dropped the ball again. Not as badly this time because they decided to actually release the game despite it being incomplete, and even with the bad reviews, it never stained the reputation of BIONICLE. 2003 was still profitable for BIONICLE even with the major overspending the LEGO Group did that year. It even allowed them to carry the line for another 2 years before a soft reboot was technically needed. The fact that they managed to repeat nearly the exact same scenario and not get thrashed for it is pretty notable too. I don't think that very many game companies could get away with that nowadays. Except for maybe one. The only major fallout the LEGO Group seemed to have was mostly by proxy. Argonaut filed for bankruptcy the following year and was fully liquidated by 2007. Not even old, cursed Haggard could save them. The sequel to BIONICLE the game, City of Legends, which was planned to release in 2004, was canned, and LEGO Interactive, the video entertainment wing of the LEGO Group, closed its doors in 2004, with no future plans to develop video games after this. Of course, until two rather small companies, LucasArts and Traveler's Tales, approached LEGO in 2005 to create LEGO Star Wars the video game, an idea that would give them a real stake in the gaming industry. BIONICLE the game was released, against all odds, for better or worse. And what is its standing in the community? It exists. It's a tie-in video game to a successful IP. I don't really know what else you want me to say. There were certainly plenty of creative liberties taken with it, but that's not from a lack of trying. A lot of the liberties it took when it comes to the lore and the canon timeline all seem to be from budgetary and time restraints. Based on what's left in the game's data, there seems to be a lot of ambition in what they wanted to cover from the first 3 years of lore. The Rahi, the Toa, and Matoran in the extra section of the game show a lot of scrap material that I'm honestly surprised even saw the light of day when this game was released. A lot of the character models are rigged for idle animations, and yet they weren't even used in the actual gameplay. And if that wasn't weird enough, there's a handful of models that were prominent characters that are T-posing in the extras section. No idle animations or anything. Regardless, the extras section gives us a whole lot of models and concept art that all make it seem like people actually gave a damn about this game. I think LEGO just saw how long it was taking them to develop what they already had, and they didn't want to risk taking longer than they already had to finish the game and potentially miss the deadline of Mask of Light, and they limped that finish line as it was. So the desire to keep the tie-in aspect seems to be the biggest weakness of the game, which is ironic, really, and it explains the corner cutting from a story standpoint. The technical standpoint, on the other hand. Part 2. My self-inflicted torture begins. I remember BIONICLE the game being passable when I played the PC version back in 2003. The most prominent memories I have are me getting legitimately frustrated at points and thinking it was all my fault. I played it again on the GameCube version after not touching it for probably 10 years, and I realized that I had very real reasons to have the gamer rage. I think the only thing that got me to power through and finish the game in any playthrough then and now was that it could be completed in under 2 hours, sometimes 1 hour if you're not a quitter. Even to this day, my hyper-focus back then was so in tune that my 5-year-old brain embedded how to complete this game in the most streamlined way possible. This was most likely to minimize my misery and trauma. So of course, my feeble memories of this game when I played it in the time before time was not good enough. I had to go and play it again. And let me tell you, going back to play it for this retrospective was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. Muscle memory has never been stronger. So this part is mostly going to cover the technical aspects of the game. I'll also pepper in my grievances with the lore as they come up, because yes, I'm petty enough about a 20-year-old game made to promote a kid's toy line to discuss how it strayed from its well-paced and established lore. I understand it sounds silly, but you have to understand this. It's not like side quests changing things up. Like, to go back to those Harry Potter games, do you remember those mini-games to make going to school entertaining until the next kid dies? And it doesn't necessarily follow the book? It's much worse than that. I'm talking about major story beats that are ripped from their placement in the timeline and put in randomly because they didn't know how to end a cutscene. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's dust off that old build of DirectX and get into it. Right off the bat, I just want to make note of the sound mixing. It is rough. Not the sound design itself, just specifically the mixing. When testing whether or not this game would run for me to get this footage, I made sure all my volume levels were adjusted so that next time I would start it up, it wouldn't make my ears bleed. I mean, just listen to that SFX competing with the music in the main menu. Alright, the first level's Tahu. What do we got? This introduction cinematic is actually pretty decent. Also, this is where the bar is set in terms of CG. It literally doesn't get any better than this. I'm sorry. The art style is pretty consistent with the years prior. There's some characters like Vakama, Takua, and to some extent Gali Nuva and Tahu Nuva later in the game that look closer to how they look in the movie. The rest seem to be an amalgamation of just about every previous incarnation in the toys, comics, and Flash games. And the Matoran appear to be putting on a play for the Toa about themselves, I guess? It's supposed to be a condensed version for those who for whatever reason bought this game and it's the first time they've ever heard of this franchise. The generic applause sound effect to reflect the 6 audience members is a nice touch. I want to mention here too that the Wikipedia makes note that they wanted to get at least the actors for the Toa from the movie to reprise their roles in the game, but scheduling prevented that. So we have a few decent sound-alikes, and then Lewa and Onua.
Nicely done. I'll save you.
Also, why does Gali have boobs? I get that she's the only female Toa on the team, but why does her mask have such prominent lips? And why does she have boobs? And a waist? And a booty? What is any of this? What is happening? Anyway, Takua crashes the party and tells them,
Something is chasing me. You have to stop it!
This part of the cinematic is actually really impressive. There's intriguing combat, pacing, and shot composition. The music in this cinematic, and just in this game as a whole, is actually really good. It almost distracted me completely from the fact that the Bo-Rock randomly show up. Or the fact that Onua says this,
Makuta leaves?
implying that they've defeated him already. But they're not wearing the golden masks at this point, and they're still defiled Rahi. Before we can even put that all together though, the action's over. So the Rahi and Bo-Rock are both here, the Toa have got to stop them in their regions, and thick Gali over here is the one to let the other 5 know.
Let us travel back to our Wahi and deal with Makuta's dark threat once and for all.
Alright, now we're getting into the first level of the game. I feel like my emulator was able to fix most of the times this happened, but I remember this one distinct fetching bug back in the day that the game would get when loading the in-game cutscenes. Starting up cutscenes had 3 possible combinations of how they wouldn't work. Because the audio track, the music track, and the video track are all built separately, the game is programmed to pull this information at the same time and try to run them in sync. But this leaves a lot of room for errors, like the audio track being pulled more than once and hearing double of everything and slightly out of sync. Sometimes you can get cutscenes with no music. It's really a lot of issues that would have been easily resolved if you just pre-rendered the cutscene. It's definitely a relic of old video game design, and obviously this would have been much easier these days, and I believe both discs that were included in the PC release were 512 megabytes at max, so pre-rendering would have likely tripled that space for just one cutscene, let alone the 17 in-game cutscenes and 5 pre-rendered cinematics. This Lamatoran in the completely wrong region is being terrorized by this Nui Kopen, and Tahu shows up presumably right after the events of the opening cinematic. And Taragavakama is already there somehow. He gives Tahu the rundown again.
Four Tahu, spirits of fire, the Tamatoran have fled from the Borak.
Do not worry, Taragavakama. I will see to their safety.
I really appreciate how seriously the game takes itself and doesn't even try to cater to anyone who would have had no idea what any of these words mean. Side note, that Nui Kopen animation just sticks it to that rock. Thought that was funny. And snap, we're in the game. To go back to what IGN said about camera controls, they suck. For the PC version, there's not even an option to bind the camera controls to the mouse. Here's how the game expects you to play on PC with the default controls. The up, down, left, and right arrows move the character. Right shift to jump, ranged attack to right control, shield/recharge with /, lock on target with comma, and camera controls are set to numpad on 8, 2, 4, and 6. Up, down, left, right. This was 5 years after Half-Life came out, and that to me was the most prominent mainstream usage of the WASD configuration for gaming. And Dark Castle in 1986 is generally accepted for the first time that this configuration was used. So there was precedent and no real reason for them to use this configuration. It's hot garbage. You're practically begging for carpal tunnel. I set it up to fit a keyboard and mouse configuration as best I could. Sorry mouse, you're taking the backseat on this one. Although, you're not missing much. The game is pretty straightforward with its tutorials as you roam with Tahu. There's basic shielding, a ranged elemental attack, and a double jump. The game brings you to a screeching halt mid-action to tell you how to do any of these things. Once you get through the explanations of a new mechanic, which there are about 7 in this opening level, the gameplay speaks for itself. Jump around, shoot things when they show up, shield when you're about to take a hit, and recharge your energy whenever it's safe and you're empty. There's light stones throughout the game, which unlock the game's extras. Not a huge incentive to get them nowadays because it's all archived in the BIONICLE Media project, so I hope you can forgive me for not making completionist status my goal here. There's a couple more scripted events that are meant to help point out stronger obstacles that you have to avoid. Enemies like Nui Jaga, Nui Rama, and Hoto bugs show up that you have to shoot or they'll keep pestering you. They phase out of existence when you shoot them enough times. The game extras claim that when you shoot them like that, you're teleporting them to a part of the island that is free from Makuta's influence. But then you shoot things later in the game like the Fiku Nui, and it sounds like you're just liberating them from existence. Take me with you. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention that a key point of progression in this mostly linear level is that you're supposed to rescue these Matoran that are along the path. They appear to also implode when you rescue them. And like I mentioned before, you're rescuing green Lamatoran from the jungle region rather than the obvious Tamatoran that shows up on your counter. There's a sprite for them and everything. You're meant to collect 5 of them so they can build a Rahi? At least that's what Takua tells me later.
We need Rahi power to open this door. But all our friendly Rahi have fled from the Borak. Rescue Matoran helpers to build a replacement.
They're just going to casually create sentient life. That's cool. No problem with that. And that Rahi will run on a treadmill that you can test out earlier in the level. So anyway, after you murder some animals, you move on to a mini-boss. A bigger Nui Jaga that has some color palette changes blocks your way through. And if given the parts, I'd build the hell out of that thing. This one is more difficult because his laser shoots barely over your head at a maximum double jump height, and your damage doesn't even do him in. And you shoot him 5 times instead of the normal 3. He gets crushed by rocks, and then your ears are assaulted by the same rock smashing sound. penultimate test of your might in this level is a mini Rahi romp that is extremely easy so long as you don't get lasered by the Nui Jaga and just spam attack and jump. Even if you're not aiming, it'll just do it for you. My run of this was so janky that I didn't even realize I beat it until he did his little celebration dance at the end. Alright, I did it. An in-game cutscene happens with Vakama inaudibly talking to Tahu while the Matoran are gods for a second. And then the Rahi is already running on the treadmill, so you don't have time to think about what you just witnessed. Now it's time for the final boss of the Tahu stage. You go through the tunnel walkway, the Rahi gym bro open for you, and find yourself on a random little rock encircled with lava. Then you're ambushed by
Korak, the Ice Bull Rock, able to shoot icy blasts from their claws. Korak, the Ice Bull Rock.
This segment in particular is a cacophony of sound mixing. There's this overwhelming loud droning noise to signify the Borak are about to show up. Then they jump out of the ground, fire these energy spheres at you, and then proceed to roll around the rock mound to keep you from leaving. They leave the orbit one at a time to take shot at you, and that's your time to strike. It takes 3 hits per Borak, and the noise they make when they get damaged is haunting. They leave the orbit randomly, so unless you're target locking, there's no way to streamline this battle. Wait, shield, attack. Wait, shield, attack. Wait, shield, attack. Tahu does a dance that honestly should be a Fortnite dance when you beat them, and he has a moment to analyze a singular Krana that they left behind. Then Takua rolls up out of nowhere and tells you indirectly that he just found the Mask of Light, which, you know, he's about 3 story arcs early at this point. And then you win! God, I'm not gonna have ears when this is over. Now it's time for Kopaka. Honestly, this game is pretty good at easily transitioning you from one stage to the other without having to go back to the main menu. It staggers a bit with getting the cutscene loaded, but it gets there eventually. Tahu lets Kopaka know that capturing the Krana is the key to defeating the Borak. Then Kopaka informs us that he's chasing a Borak at that very moment, while casually walking. It's like something out of Revenge of the Sith.
We must move quickly.
Alright, now it's time for Tony Hawk Pro Snowboarding. In an effort to make you forget the camera controls are a waking nightmare, the game locks the camera into a front-facing perspective for the first 20 seconds of the level. That way you can have no idea what to expect and see the ice fall apart behind Kopaka like Scrat just found a new spot for his acorn! And that's only partially a joke because I honestly can't think of any other reason why they would do this. This is a very table scraps level. There's a lot of concepts that are introduced almost as quickly as they're dismissed. The front-facing camera, Kopaka's special ability is to change the third-person perspective to first-person, but only sometimes?
What? What? You could do that whenever? Are you kidding me?
And a Borak chase mechanic. That's another thing! Where Tahu's level had a pretty cohesive point A to point B across his region, Kopaka's level is divided into 4 very uneven segments. So I guess the best way to go through this is to just go through each of them in order. The first sequence is a pretty standard beat the timer level, and it's a tight timer, I might add. I mean, it's pretty easy nowadays, but I remember having to master the motor skills like never before in order to beat it. The mechanics are pretty straightforward, and it's the most bearable level in terms of gimmicks. And what I mean by that is that when it's not a standard 3D platformer, this has the gimmick that isn't completely level breaking. Well, almost. We'll get to that later. There isn't a whole lot to add to this specific segment other than the fact that it's pretty enjoyable to just snowboard through the region and see a lot of decently rendered landscapes. Apart from the glorified tutorial, once you get to the Kini, Turaga Nuju tells you that the Borak ignored it completely and decided to head straight to Kokoro.
Toa Kopaka, the Borak has burrowed through
That voice!
I feel
There's not really a
sorry
frame
for
of reference because Turaga Nuju has 0 lines in the movie, and I guess it would have been awkward if they stuck to the canon where he only speaks in clicks and whistles, but that is absurd. This next segment has the most jarring aesthetic change to them all. The first few meters you snowboard puts you in the standard character camera setup, but once the game confirms your position in the game's world, it triggers a locked camera into the first-person perspective. Even hitting the key to trigger your special doesn't take you out of it. It's completely jarring and the field of vision is static and there's literally no point for it. I have tried so many times to navigate this section to get all of the light stones, and I'm pretty sure it's actually impossible. Someone in the community who's played this before, if you can prove it's possible, send me the links, I need it. Anyway, this is where the small spike in difficulty kicks in. The Borak referenced in the last 2 cutscenes is a singular Gallock. This segment puts your snowboarding skills to the test. In order to make the Gallock vulnerable to attack, you have to shield when you're next to it to launch it in the air in front of you. You're able to fire off about 3 to 4 shots per shield parry. There's a pretty arbitrary health bar that it shows when you're in hot pursuit, and it takes 9 hits to kill. There's 2 segments like this, and with each one, if you beat them quick enough, the segment comes to a screeching halt, and you get to completely ignore some of the pretty decently rendered regions that you zoom past. For formality's sake, I will say that the failure cinematic is pretty dark in its tone. There's buildings on fire and Matoran running away in fear of the Gallock. It's pretty great, except if you're like me and failed this several times as a kid, you had to see this unskippable cutscene a lot. The game is also extremely hit or miss, literally, when there's no telling from any apparent frame data when you and your enemies are vulnerable to attack. There's so many instances throughout each level where I think I have the right timing for an attack based on previous interactions, but the elemental energy just decides to not connect with the target. After Gallock is defeated, you're informed of yet another Borak that Turaga Nuju calls the Swarm Leader. He's headed down the mountain, and you must find him before it gets to the next arbitrary point B of another segment. And uh-oh, there's a lot of landslides that happen on this particular mountain. Be careful! This takes you into the 3rd segment of the level. It's the shortest segment, and incidentally, it's complete bullshit. The Swarm Leader pushes a boulder through the canyon, and these 2 little brats do absolutely nothing to stop it or warn you. So once again, the game randomly locks the camera in the front-facing position for the Indiana Jones ripoff. It's simple enough to avoid the boulder. However, at what appears to be completely random moments throughout the level, the boulder will occasionally throw smaller rocks which are somehow traveling faster than the boulder. And if any of them hit you, they reduce your speed drastically to the point where the boulder eventually obliterates you. These rocks are ridiculous. You can't jump over them, they ignore your shield, and it's very easy to slalom into the walls of the canyon while avoiding them, which also slows you down. But in what some would consider an impossible scenario to get out of a canyon, the walls eventually stop the boulder and you move on. This random Matoran segues you into the final segment. It's nearly identical to the Gallock segment, just with a much different path, and different consequences should you fail. It's a good excuse to show the rendered Borak that would have been otherwise scrapped if their idling animations weren't used in this cutscene. There's not a whole lot to note here, except for some random obstacles, and the environment is obviously a bit different. The Tannock you chase mixes it up a bit by having a static attack that he can put on the ground behind him that shocks you if you board into it. It also burrows a lot more often than the previous Borak chase. The Tannock is also represented on the boss health bar with the same compressed Gallock product photo. The end cutscene shows the completely mechanical Tannock acting like it's winded, laying on the ground. Kopaka picks up the Krana in front of him, and that's it. That's game. GG. This level drained me and we gotta move on, and we still have 6 more of these. Pre-rendered cinematic time! In the first blatant level cutting, once the first 2 levels are done, the Toa beat the Barag Queens off screen and become the Toa Nuva. And I gotta say, I can tell there was a lot of time and love put into these designs. And if it technically didn't lead into their illegal builds with the actual sets, these would be some spectacular looks to the characters. Especially small things like keeping that Technic handpiece on most of the Toa and making that the default hands for all of them, except for Onua. Plus, the Nuva masks have some nice tweaks to make them look a bit better than the set counterparts. There's even a very streamlined version of the art team's design of these characters in the game's extras that show just how much they enjoyed adapting the look of the Toa Nuva. And then the dreams are dashed as we are brought back into reality. The Borak Kal immediately rear their heads in Ga-Wahi with no explanation. Tannock Kal throws a random Matoran off screen. The music suddenly crescendos and then stops completely for an interaction with Turaga no Kama and Gali Nuva.
Gali?
I may be changed to Raganokama, but my love for my people remains the same.
Gali Nuva's level is probably the least broken level in the game. When playing through this game as a kid, the Gali Nuva level was probably the one I played the most. It's got the most cohesive structure to the world, and it even encourages this natural flow of returning to previously explored areas to get more secrets you couldn't reach before. It's pretty intuitive. If there's one thing I'm happy about with the rushed production, it's that I never have to see what a normal Toa Gali level would play like. Please God, no. Having to play with that cursed model would have been disturbing. Most of her feminine proportions are more filled in with the Nuva armor in this level. She's got a bit of an Elastigirl ass on her, but we'll let that slide. The environment here is quite nice. Ga-Wahi is a beautiful little region. Coming back to this was a lot of fun. The swimming mechanics are actually very well developed. Her special abilities include a swimming boost, diving after double jumping for greater depth in the waters, and the mechanic that other Nuva can use, but it's only really useful in this level, the Nuva Blast. You're introduced to it pretty early on here, but evolving from the mechanic of charging your elemental energy, after charging to full, you hit your special and it sends an energy blast that breaks these cages that have trapped Matoran and kills all nearby enemies. Fun fact, because of this game, this ability was later put in canon. However, it was changed to a Nova Blast because other Toa that weren't Toa Nuva could use it, but they would die and only Toa Nuva are powerful enough to survive doing it. although it still wouldn't be used as frequently as you're expected to in this level. There's 4 of these cages here, and like any other good idea in this game, the Nuva Blast, swimming, and diving are all one-trick ponies. They're either not used again, or totally useless from here on out. The Collectathon is a bit more prominent in Gali Nuva's level. The Lightstone count is the second lowest amount in the game, but the Matoran you collect is suddenly shot up to 15. But even then, the game only requires 13 to advance to the final section of the game. This is what I meant by this level is the least broken. There's much more conditional formatting for advancing through the level. The design of the areas is pretty decently detailed, and like I said before, there's a couple of times where you're expected to go back to previous sections to either access things you couldn't reach before, or navigate with a combo of swimming and platforming. How do they screw it up? The platforming isn't as forgiving as the Tahu level. A lot of this can be attributed to the invisible walls that line the waterfall-esque landscape. That on top of the sloppy physics and kung fu fighting level of timing on your jumps to get to proper vertical and horizontal distance. The camera is static on the y-axis when you're swimming, so you can only pan it around Gali Nuva. So looking down to see any lightstones that might be under you to properly angle your dive is super hard. But I was still honestly surprised with myself that I could time the dives right to get all the lightstones. Some quick highlights of this level include some great diving sections and platforming, some interesting interactions with the environment like energy cages, the crane that lifts a boulder to access the kini, and the new rahi designs. The ruki fish, the makika toads, they're pretty sweet looking. Once you get the adequate amount of Matoran, you walk up to Turaga no Kama for a 3rd time. I guess they do the same thing as the Tahu level and build a new rahi? Or their joined bellows perform the proper mating call for a whale rahi. Whatever it is, it's never properly shown. They just climb on inside him and they're taken into the great unknown. It seems almost completely unrelated to anything because Gali isn't even in this cutscene. Suddenly, the game triggers the Borak Kal boss fight. Yes, the entirety of the Borak Kal arc was so insignificant in the eyes of the developers that it skips the arc of the power loss, the awakening of the queens, Tahu Nuva wearing the Mask of Time. None of it matters!
Trash!
You're taken into the world's most intense sewer drain in the Borak Kal roll-up. Gali Nuva single-handedly defeats all of the Borak Kal and doesn't seem to break a sweat in the process. And out of nowhere, Takua is also there. Gali Nuva is as shocked as we are. He's incredibly wishy-washy on the next threat here, but Gali Nuva gets the hint and decides to warn Onua Nuva. Now we move on to Pohatu Nuva, even though she just said Onua. For the uninitiated, the elements of earth and stone in this universe are pretty nebulous on their actual differences, so I can understand that Gali Nuva might have gone to him by accident. It's a bit racist, but we'll allow it. No, I'm totally kidding, she knows the difference. She just decided to outsource the warning of Onua to Pohatu instead, but he's not gonna stand for her laziness. Yeah, he'll warn Onua, sure, but she's gotta go warn Lewa.
Find Lua. Find Lua.
This almost seems like it would lead up to the virtue of unity for them to come together and stop this threat. Again, rush production. Doesn't happen. Gali, in her clairvoyance, suddenly realizes there's a Pomatoran apparently stuck. On some stairs? He seems perfectly fine, but he's also stuck in Bionicle the game, so that's understandable. Alright, now we're playing as Pohatu Nuva. His region is pretty limited. It's decently designed for this one domain, but that's mostly because the level is underneath our feet. Pohatu has some pretty wonky things going on with his model with this section of the level. If you didn't know what was coming up here, then a lot of what I'm about to go through won't make any sense. The biggest oddity is that when he fires his elemental energy, his model locks into what appears to be a seated position and his hands extended as if he's holding onto a bar. Once again, this is corner cutting for what we were about to see in the next section. Once you go through the painstakingly difficult parkour and get the lightstones for this region, you trigger an event by going to the landing of the staircase. The cutscene plays out and the stairs collapse and a sinkhole appears for absolutely no reason. After a very elongated fall, he lands gently in the sand below and then confronts the Matoran. This one seems to have a pretty standard Picari-style mask, Takua once again being the black sheep here. Pohatu doesn't know how they're meant to get out of there, but know-it-all Matoran over here says he's gotta unlock that door with 6 switches. And just like that, we're thrown into a minecart level. Woo! Yes, that seated position he was in from earlier, that's his assumed position for the rest of the section. Like the boulder segment in the Kopaka level, this minecart area is total bullshit. The only instructions they give you are the same as Kopaka's snowboarding segments. Speed up and slow down with the up and down directions, and jump with the spacebar. There is one additional dialogue that tells you that the cart runs on your elemental energy, and the speed that you can go is affected by how much energy you have. There are green energy spheres like the light stones that will fill up your elemental energy, but even that doesn't prove to be true half the time. The goal is to trip these switches that are arbitrarily placed alongside the track. That's not necessarily the tricky part. The mechanics of when the minecart speeds up and slows down are the things that will make, but mostly break, this level. Like I said before, even with the crystals you can collect that refill your elemental energy along the track, the game has scripted events where it will override whatever speed you're putting on the minecart. It does it almost randomly, and sometimes it will be in the wide open to pad the runtime of the level, or it'll speed you up when you're trying to time an attack on an obstacle on the track and you can't jump over it. Because the arc is so huge when jumping with the minecart, some obstacles are absolutely unavoidable. And even if you avoid one, there are times where the one right after will definitely hit you. It sucks. I hate this level. The game takes you through the same stretch of track every single time you miss one of the 6 switches. Since I was a little kid when this came out, I played this section for an absurd amount of time purely because I didn't realize there were switches involved. That, and I didn't realize that once you got through the entire course, it fades to black, runs a quick win condition check, and determines whether or not to release you from the seemingly endless hell. The game does thankfully save all of the switches you did hit, so it doesn't necessarily have to be all in one go, although I highly recommend it purely so you never have to do the section with the stone statues and their rock axes more than once. That area is pure torture, and it's doubly insulting since it's right at the very end of the level. The overall aesthetic of the caves of Motunui is really nice looking, and this seems to be the one section of the game that was part of the original plan and survived getting canned. The fact that a majority of the Tahu Nuva levels were saved in this process is genuinely impressive. Once you hit all 6 switches, the game fades to black with the same win condition check. When you pass the condition check, you abruptly jump out of the cart and leave the Matoran for dead, I guess. This particular cutscene is its own kind of bad.
Onua, my friend!
Pohatu!
Oh no. So up until this point, I haven't really acknowledged the voice acting because it's been passable. It hasn't grated on me to the point where it was worthy of discussion. These last few though, I don't want to demean the work of the voice actors themselves, but the direction is just awful. Onua Nuva in particular, his first couple lines in the intro cinematic sound like they were done by a completely different person. Either that or he had slightly less marbles in his mouth in the opening cinematic. Onua and Pohatu meet up and Pohatu says this.
Gali wanted to warn you of creatures. Creatures like this!
He didn't even see what the Rakshi looked like before this, it just appears, but that's par for the course of this game. It's just so jarring all at once. And then Onua has far too much dialogue. Pohatu's level was all about him heading to another level for another Toa. Once it's finished, Onua sends him once again to go warn Tahu about the Rakshi.
Me great pleasure.
That way Onua can be alone to get absolutely clapped on by Lewa. Onua runs a little bit forward and jumps so high the ray tracing gets messed up on his mask. Lewa smacks him once with the staff, and Onua falls to the floor, and Pohatu's level is over. Why am I still doing this? Oh God, it never ends. And now for Onua Nuva. You literally fall right into it. After the quick break from the pace of Pohatu's level, Onua's is another free-roaming platformer. This appears to be another one of those instances where it was the most finished of the levels, so they kept it in. One major change here is that starting from now, water is no longer your friend. The moment a single pixel of your hitbox touches water, boom, dead, reset. The region of Onuahi is one of the more complete designs of the game. Because it's underground, they couldn't use any shortcuts like the static blue sky background like they did with Pohatu and Gali's level. Every tunnel, hallway, and area had to be textured with this earthy environment to fit the region. Something that is only minorly explored in this level alone is that the Rakshi seem to be terraforming the regions. The areas seem to have a consistent look that remains fairly neutral. A nice little homestead for all Onu Matoran to populate. You know, if it weren't slowly falling apart. But the further you progress through Onua's level, statues appear to be erected for the Rakshi, even though they're just meant to destroy the island looking for the Mask of Light and its herald. Don't worry, we'll sort of get to that eventually. The environment is very well made. There's some one-off concepts introduced again here that are fun. There's some good platforming in this one that is far more forgiving than Gali or Tahu's level. To remind you that Onua primarily wears the Mask of Strength, there's a gimmick of pushing big stones onto buttons that activate doors. Even though it's not the most conventional means to kill everything, the Nova Blast is also usable here. However, because of the 3D environment, they will need to be on the same axis as you in order for them to die. There's a good mixture of old and new Rahi that you fight in this one. The Hoto, Nui Jaga, Nui Rama, and the Fiku all come back. The Fiku in particular is actually a viable enemy in this level. It takes a couple hits to kill, and if you don't watch the ceiling, they'll jump onto you like the Skulltula in Ocarina of Time. But I had to be positive before I got to the one part right before the Layrock boss. After you beat another small cluster of Nui Rama, a corridor opens up to a pack of 8 Kane Ra. This section is far more difficult than it needs to be. It's harder than the boss at the end of this level. The Kane Ra are blocked by about a quarter of the tunnel being fenced off to not interfere with their target practices. Yes, in what appears to be a normally trafficked tunnel, there's a section that allows 8 raging bulls to do target practice. The goal of the section is to pass the line of scrimmage without being bashed out of existence. The autosave is right before this section, so if you die at any point, you have to start all over. The patterns are pretty easy to pick out, but to mix things up, the Kane Ra will occasionally throw an extra immediate second wind that is not discernible in any way. There's a combined wind and hurt box on these guys, so that sometimes it can be forgiving and just nicely push you back if you mistime the jump. There's no jumping over them, there's no going around them, and there's no sanity when you're done. We get to casually walk through the sections I mentioned earlier that have been taken over by Makuta before we get to the alleged big baddie, Layrock. There is nothing in the canon that is even remotely close to what's going on in this room. Layrock is the Rakshi of poison. Because of this, he appears to be in a pneumatic tube that helps him siphon his powers. And you can't convince me otherwise that this was the inspiration for the angel fight in Borderlands 2. This boss isn't super difficult, but it's quite the time vampire. This is definitely one of the longest fights in the whole game. It's not a battle of wits or physicality, but a battle of pushing. Nothing but pushing. It's super unique. There are 6 vents in the floor that are protected by a dome that open and close over each one. When one closes, the other clockwise to the previous vent opens. The vents are divided by pipes and have a stone in each division. The goal is to push the stone into each vent when it opens. The stone will shoot like a cannonball into one of the 6 tubes hooked up to Layrock's machine. There's no explanation as to whether or not this weakens Layrock or lowers his health to egg it into a duel. When all 6 stones are shot into the tubes, the giant contraption above Layrock falls onto him and just crushes and kills Layrock and the level's over. Sure, why not? No problems here. The fact that we're getting closer to the end of the game means that we're going to see more and more abruptness to the progression of the levels. I can almost hear the producers saying, "It's good, call it, that's a wrap, good enough, ship it." Ah yes, Lewa Nuva. Or should I say, Lua Nuva. This one is a real treat. It's the 6th of the 8 levels, and is probably the last one that I would constitute a level with a cohesive narrative. It has a good beginning, followed by the harshest decline into another mediocre finish. It has a very strong start though. Gali shows up and Lewa knows she's coming because of the drums of Le Koro. This is one piece of lore that I'm honestly amazed stays in the writing of the game. It's referenced in the movie as well.
The drums of Le Koro bring a sorry bad story.
And it's across the board how Lewa allegedly first hears about the Rakshi. Around the time period that this game was released, I believe the comics were what was reliable canon, where Gali and Tahu hear about the Rakshi at the same time and fight a set of 3 Rakshi, and Lewa eventually joins that fight. So this little bit of canon shining through is surprising. The level for Lewa Nuva is my 2nd most frequently played level, I would say, from my childhood. Nothing from the tech demo shown earlier appeared to survive to the final game, but what replaced it is a rather large and spacious area of Lewahi. It seems to split up into 3 sections. As it says in the introductory cutscene, Lewa needs to get to the section of Lewahi that Panrak is ravaging, but he needs to find and free the Lematoran to reactivate his Suva, or his shrine. So the primary focus of Section 1 is to find and save the 6 Matorans scattered through it. This is the shortest area since it's meant to showcase Lewa's dexterity and capabilities among the trees. And it's super fun! I genuinely love this part. It sort of combines the snowboarding of Kopaka with the minecart in the Pohatu level, but it keeps it simple, minimizes large movements on the branches, and allows for great reflexes to actually decide whether or not you clear the courses. Branch surfing is really cool, and your goal is to shoot the balloons that the Matoran are hanging from, and that will send them to the Suva. This area has good variety, like these poisonous plants on the track, these overhead acorn things that you need to shoot, and fun little pads for enhanced jumping. This is another level where there's quite a few gimmicks or play mechanics that are super cool, and I enjoyed playing this one. Even though Gali's level was the one that I went back to the most, I would say 2nd place would go to the first 2 parts of Lewa's level. Yes, you heard me right. Just the first 2. Just like how Kopaka's level was split into 4 segments, Lewa Nuva's level is divided into 3. The main difference is that rather than a cutscene separating them out and being the glue between all of them, the one from 2 and 3 can be reasonably done without the cutscene. And then Section 3 is an actual waking nightmare to play. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. Once you snag the 6 Matoran, they do this odd dance to activate the Suva. That teleports you to the 2nd section. This is where things get really interesting. The second section introduces a really cool mechanic. After double jumping and pressing the button for your special, Lewa Nuva will glide forward and slightly downward for about 4 seconds. The controls are a little janky since the turn radius is pretty sizable, but it's still very useful and programmed very well. It's meant to be your main method of platforming throughout this level. When I talked in the beginning about muscle memory kicking in hardcore, this was the level in particular that I was thinking of. I had pathed out the area so well from trial and error as a kid that I found myself jumping and gliding to platforms I didn't even check for first when I was playing this time. I just knew they'd be there. I had to go back and intentionally go through this area a bit slower just to get some decently usable footage. The area to test out this ability is pretty short and sweet and gradually transitions you into a pretty fun section with platforming on temporary islands and such. But the overall look of Lewa is spot on. The game has specific environmental triggers that determine what music track will play in certain parts of Lewa's level, and these songs are pretty well arranged for the environment they're meant to convey. This big orchestral sound with the choir while you navigate the jungle landscape is something I haven't really seen before. In other jungle-themed levels and other video games, they primarily focus on a more percussion-based sound with some occasional woodwinds and other flutes. This one has this more towards the swampy region of Section 3, but Sections 1 and 2 have this lead violin sound that is energetic and engaging. It's really cool. Apart from that, there's not anything hugely significant until you swing from the blade of a windmill to get to a high cliff and take the balloon lift to Section 3. Pretty roundabout way to get to Section 3. Section 3 starts off with a cutscene of Panrak roaming the swampy region and making his way to where you'll eventually fight him. Panrak! My first Bionicle set that I ever got. Oh good. I think I broke the game. Yep, it's not supposed to do that. I am not supposed to be gliding toward the ground, right? Oh, well, cool. It's, once again, pretty arbitrary where it is compared to your placement in the swamp, but it's not necessarily relevant since the path is straightforward and there's nowhere you can really go but where the platforms choose. This area has some extremely random spikes in difficulty that I can just tell were barely play-tested. You use some of the usual decaying plants to navigate most of the section. However, there's one concept of platforming that is very confusing. There's these bubbles that are floating up to you in a sequence where you're meant to jump on them to get to the next static platform. This is first of all universe breaking because this doesn't happen anywhere in canon that would warrant this to be a noteworthy method of platforming. Lava surfing? I can get behind. Random 3-team free-for-all pseudo-lacrosse? Sure. This doesn't make any sense. And that's just from a physics standpoint. In terms of the technical aspects, these are hard to time because you're meant to time when you land on it with when you stop gliding to get to them. Since they're spherical, the faces of the prism that determine whether you're on the bubble or you fall to your death are completely nebulous. It leaves very little room for error, and I can't believe this is still difficult to this day. But this is only just the beginning. After the bubbles and traversing another random line of decaying plants, a text box appears to give you a tutorial of the worst segment in the entire game. I'm not even kidding. I know I already said this about the boulder in the Kopaka level and the minecart in the Pohatu level, but the Gecko bird in the Lewa Nuva level is total bullshit. It's not playful this time. This is actually ridiculous how unfair this is. The instructions clearly state that you're just meant to activate your glide and the Gecko will start flying. It makes a gust of wind that will increase the length of your glide before you time out. So long as you stay behind it, you will fly for longer than usual. This is the only way to reach the area to fight Panrak. If you were to just beeline it to the end, that would make things easier. But for absolutely no reason, there's a weird serpentine path through several trees that the Gecko indirectly takes you to get to the checkpoint. The turns it takes around the trees are sharp, abrupt, and will take you completely the wrong direction from the boss entrance most of the time. Another huge problem is that when it's going around the trees, it's slower than your gliding speed, but slightly faster than you when traveling in a straight line. If you don't jump slightly in front of it when you start, you won't keep up and you'll die. There's nothing but water underneath, and when you die, you have to start all over. For this recording, this section took me 15 minutes of attempts to complete. To add insult to injury, the checkpoint trigger for the next area is slightly past the safe rock position in the waterline somewhere. This is so that when you finish the area, the game will automatically take you out of Lewa's glide. And if you don't touch any part of the rocks before you hit the water, you're dead. Restart. It is merciful if you don't actually land on top of the rocks. Even if you're close to just grazing the side, it counts it and you can advance. But that doesn't shake the infinite bitterness I have with this section, because this is the second to last area before you reach the boss. There's no other reason for them to use this, and this mechanic is never used again. Once you glide past this poor excuse for more piston-type platforming, you reach Panrak. And now it's time for you to play Spleef. This fight can range anywhere from chaotic to the easiest boss fight in the game. These individual rafts are like chess squares that Panrak can only make moves on like a chess king. The key is to shoot the rafts so that they can corner Panrak and it drowns. You don't have any control over which of the rafts you shoot. The game just randomly targets one and it will hit it for you, most of the time. The only strategy is to hope that in its random jumping, Panrak will eventually get itself to a point where it throws its projectile at rafts you're standing on to corner itself. Either that, or you can just spam your attack until it starts hitting rafts that are near Panrak, although it's incredibly easy to lose track of which ones you've already destroyed because the camera is so janky. Once you beat the gods of RNG and Panrak pins itself, a cutscene will play of Lewa standing on the dock, holding a Krana, which they don't wear, and he yells in victory and the level's just over!
Sure! Why not if you're just making stuff up at this point? Makes perfect sense to me!
Oh, I cannot believe how quickly this is going downhill. Alright, 2 more levels. I can do this. Okay, so we're moving on to the one and only repeat Toa in the game. Tahu Nuva makes his comeback for the second to last level. We catch him and Takua mid-conversation about the Mask of Light that Takua found off screen at the end of the first level in the game, in case you forgot. This is the loose tie-in aspect of the game, and it extremely loosely connects it to the movie and canon. Pohatu shows up just in time to hear that the Mask of Light was stolen by the Rakshi and they're heading to destroy Takoro. Tahu Nuva tells Pohatu to take Takua to safety and that he'll deal with the Rakshi. Immediately, he finds the Kurok and chases it. This takes us back to a similar format to the Borok segments of Kopaka's level, only vastly shorter and with ridiculous rubber banding. With the mechanic of racing in video games, rubber banding happens when the NPC gets a sudden increase in speed to intentionally zoom past the player to give it a greater difficulty and allow for more competitiveness. As if this level even needed it. Tahu Nuva's level seems to have missing mechanics or programming that make this tremendously harder. There's significantly more obstacles on the track that will definitely impact your perfect run of this level. There are sections where stalactites will fall on you, which you're only warned of with slightly more rock cracking noises than usual. Some of them appear to ignore your shielding and will just stab through you if you're not spamming your shield enough through each cycle. There's falling rock pillars and rock columns that need to be shot or shielded through to avoid, and crushing pistons that are just in the middle of the flow for no reason. There's a quickly thrown together tracker in the top right to show who's in front of the other. And by that I mean there's no map, just enlarged PNGs of their modeled heads, and the one on top is the one who's currently in the lead. The rubber banding causes Kurok to just randomly clip through Tahu Nuva, do damage, and can restart the whole run if Kurok happens to hit you when you're on your last of your 4 hits. Despite the fact that this level is so short, the corner cutting and programming really shines through with what can slow you down. Like you can be doing your best to maneuver through the lava flow and you're suddenly soft-locked on obstacles in the middle of the river. Trying to jump over certain rock hurdles can lead to invisible walls, and the game just decides you need a location reset. There's no reverse, just slowing down. You should not use it if you plan on winning. The failure cutscene shows Tahu Nuva falling to a supposed death from a jump, and Kurok's destruction of the Koro is only implied. The Mask of Light literally clipped to its arm, and the island doomed. To contrast this, the most glaring win condition check in the whole game is triggered, since the next event is the 3rd pre-rendered cinematic. When you win, it just stops with the model of Tahu Nuva in the middle of a black void and starts counting your lightstones. I will never understand why there's no clear cutscene to indicate victory. Maybe the pre-rendered cinematic was finished before this level, and rather than trying to program something that could flow better into the cinematic, they just called it quits. Okay, I hope you're ready for a lore rant, because this is the most jarring and disorienting straying from the timeline. The Kurok just randomly explodes from Tahu beating it, and the Mask of Light just starts bouncing to the Koro. Pohatu apparently decided that seeing the Chronicler's safety meant take him to the exact place that the Kurok will destroy if I don't make it there in time. Anyway, the Mask of Light, with its already rendered eyes on the mask, eventually bounces its way to Takua. The mask appears to just decide on its own that it will go on his face. Tahu Nuva shows concern from a distance that he's worried the mask might hurt Takua, but the mask transforms Takua into a Toa and he stares blankly into the unknown before teleporting away. Now hold on a second! Keep in mind, this is a tie-in game to Bionicle Mask of Light the movie. This movie is a continuation of the story of Takua. I haven't really talked a whole lot about this character, but there's a ton about him and his character that was either planned from the beginning of the line or retconned to better contextualize why he's more of a chosen one archetype. In most of the games and online animations, you see the events of the story of 2001 to 2003 through the eyes of Takua. He was always different, kept to himself, didn't like to be in the way, and when Destiny had a plan for him even before he became the 7th Toa, he actively avoided it while simultaneously going out to search for the adventure. Including going to search for the Herald of the Mask of Light, knowing full well, potentially the whole time, that it was him all along. It makes me think of the Master Oogway line. One often meets his destiny on the road he takes to avoid it. The movie is subpar in terms of its animation being timeless or some of the voice acting and some dialogue being silly, but where it shines through, no pun intended, is the story of Takua accepting his destiny and realizing that since he was always different, he's the perfect choice to wear the Mask of Light and decides for himself to become Nuva, the Toa of Light. That being said, 2003 got the biggest curb stomping in terms of the lore here. Not only was the Borak Call arc ignored, like I talked about earlier, but this is completely neutered and it's the biggest detriment to this game. If this was someone's only exposure to the universe, this would be an abysmal representation of the story. I would also understand if someone thought it was stupid that people like me are still fans of this line to this day if this was their only context for the universe. But I will go back to the storytelling aspect later because we need to wrap it up for the final level of Takua Nuva. Okay, let's just get it over with. Another pre-rendered cinematic fires up and Nuva is suddenly in Makuta's lair. No need to get a vehicle or anything. We'll just add teleportation to the list of things that he can do that's never brought up again. He challenges Makuta and tells him that he's there to end him and awaken Motunui. Makuta is obviously peeved and accepts the challenge. And this voice acting is pretty amazing in the worst way, since Nuva's is just pitch shifted down from Takua, and Makuta is just straight up Immortan Joe.
Within the blink of an eye. Send off my war rig to bring back gasoline.
Here it is, the final boss of the game. Makuta has two different phases. There's no health bar, as was common for games of this era. However, understanding the geometry of the stage will give you a good understanding real quick of what to expect. There's 4 circles on the outer rim of a big platform. Makuta will teleport to them one by one and summon Rahi for you to beat before he moves to the next circle. If you approach him while any of the Rahi are still active, he'll damage you, and he's invulnerable for this phase. Something to note before we get too far into this is that Nuva can fly through the air similar to Lewa Nuva. It's not the most useful mechanic for the level, except maybe as a quick save for the second phase, but that'll make more sense when we get there. Nuva is a great upgrade in power when it comes to the average Toa. Every attack input shoots 2 bolts of elemental energy, and his shield is the strongest as holding it doesn't trigger the elemental charging. He never runs out of energy. But because you can never trigger the energy charge, you don't have access to the Nuva Blast. I doubt it would really be useful in this fight anyway. The Rahi are just the usual ones you've fought primarily in Tahu, Gali Nuva, and Onua Nuva's levels. There's nothing changed to their functionality. You just kill them all and he moves on to the next section of the ring. When he's back in the center, he'll send out only the flying Rahi. Then Makuta will just randomly fall through the floor with his big ball of energy above his head, and Nuva jumps down with him to make sure he finishes the job. The cutscene to show the descent down this pipe is a bit weird. There's 2 different audio tracks that it will run, and I honestly can't tell at this point which one was meant to go where. There's one with a bit more foley of Nuva landing on a rock, Makuta firing a ball of energy at Nuva, and he reflects it back at Makuta, playing a damage groan from Makuta. That all seems to play right each time, but the foley track is sometimes pulled too late and it will play in the middle of Makuta setting up the second phase in-game. It's really bizarre, and it can alternate which process it goes with every time you die and reset the phase. But I digress. Makuta sets the stage and creates an impenetrable shield around himself that can only be disabled by landing on falling rocks that have Makuta's emblems on them. Once you land on them, they'll be hit with lightning and rotate to indicate they've been deactivated. Once you do that to all 4, Makuta launches another shadow ball at you, and deflecting it damages him and triggers the next step. Some of the rocks will fall faster and you won't be able to platform on them anymore. This is where the Lewa glide comes in handy. You do the exact same thing and deflect the shadow balls again, and that triggers the final pissed phase. The platforms with Makuta's face will fall and the shield is taken away for good. Makuta throws more shadow balls that you shield back at him and then jump and shoot him until he groans again. To keep you from idling, the game will wait 5 seconds after you land on a platform and shake violently and spin it in place. Makuta will eventually die after 3 cycles of this. The game triggers a cutscene where Nuva will jump off the rocks and the shadow ball above you will implode and shatter everything but Makuta and his platform that free falls through the victory screen. I remember this being a bit of a challenge growing up, but it was a walk in the park this time. Which brings us to the ending cinematic. We did it. The final cinematic is the last assault on the senses.
Let's take a closer look at your shadows.
Oh no! So, in terms of the movie portrayal of the canon, there's still some things that are left open for interpretation of what goes on in Makuta's lair. Makuta and Nuva do form a fusion, but this version ignores the energized protodermis aspect. And the fusion technically brings balance to light and darkness, but the whole idea is that Nuva creates the fusion by just putting his mask over Makuta's. It's bold, but it's awful. Especially when the mask already has the eyes rendered onto it and the combined voices are so badly mixed.
Has been exiled
must awaken the Great Spirit.
The fusion opens this gate that awakens the Great Spirit, apparently, and that's the game. And then we get credits. Lots and lots of credits. From what I was able to read, it appears they included all the credits for the PC, PS2, GameCube, and Xbox ports all into these credits because the game is pretty much the same across all those platforms. But these are longer than the last 2 levels in the game. It's insane. Even crazier still that not a single one of them had public contact info I could find to maybe ask them about the development of this game. And it's done. Just the same main menu. Not as momentous of a victory as some might expect, but that's all it has. Once the game is completed, there's not a whole left to try and get things to 100%. There's game extras that can be unlocked based on meeting the required lightstone amounts per level, but yeah, not much else. Part 3. What's the moral of the story here? So the question we can analyze now is, how did this happen? How did the game fall so short, and where did it take us from here? Just to be clear before I start this part, this analysis will be strictly conjectural, meaning I have no proof that anything I'm saying here is the real story and therefore true. I'm simply taking my base knowledge of video game development, professional deadlines, and running a business to draw some educated conclusions as to what could have gone wrong and how that would tie into what we know happened next. I know that obscure content like this can lead to obscure connections, so if this happens to land in the lap of someone who worked on this game and was closely connected to it, I'd love to hear more about it. My social media is open for communication at my pages for the BIONICLE Collective or in the comments below. Anyway, let's start spinning a story. When a project goes awry in the media industry, there's the easy go-to factors that obviously hinder the process: money and time. I talked a bit about the time aspect in part 1 and how there was a deadline of finishing the game before the release of the movie on DVD in September 2003. But with that deadline in sight, and even with today's standards, that's an insane turnaround time for a video game to be fully developed, programmed, play-tested, and finalized. A little over a year to compile all of that basically from scratch is a lot to ask for, especially since pre-production supposedly would have ended when they officially announced it in May 2003. Depending on how much development was done in that, which usually isn't much, my guess would be it went towards the independent animations that ended up just being promotional material. Cinematics showing the Toa in their respective regions doing some fun acrobatics to promote the game and things of that sort. Like I said in between the Pohatu and Onua levels, this is not to demean the work of Argonaut or the effort they put into the game at the time, especially since there's little preservation of the work of these individuals. Sure, they're credited at the end of the game, but the dissolution of Argonaut Games almost immediately after this means that more than likely, all company-level preservation died with it. The amount of potential strain that EA could have put on Argonaut also comes to mind simply because nowadays, they're practically infamous for it. EA had its hand in practically every facet of gaming in the early 2000s, and they had left lots of comparatively smaller companies in the dust with this treatment. Once again, this is strictly my opinion, and I'm drawing conclusions based on the hindsight of the business practices of relevant parties. This is not an industry that can be easily navigated. In the grand scope of things, video games are barely coming into their own when it comes to being a legitimate art form. It's probably only been within the last 10 to 15 years or so that video games have been developed for the general public to acknowledge their true impact on our culture. There are clearly several examples of video games that captured our hearts and were able to tell wonderful stories before this, but their stigma of being mindless distractions to our own world hasn't done a whole lot to allow people with those opinions to see the effort that goes into the games we admire most. And because of this, a vast majority of video games developed in the last 20 years have had to double down on their ability to recognize those individuals that played a part in making them. Long gone are the days where you only needed about a half a dozen people to make a game. Hundreds of people go into a project now and have the potential to push the frontiers of technology in order to make the games we play. The mindset that we have to consider when looking at these examples of both old and new is whether it was true passion pushing this project or the potential to make money. In my eyes, I can't help but think it's an imbalance for both for BIONICLE the game. Despite the obvious inconsistencies that I talked about, this could have easily been a game with no effort or sensibility to the story it's based upon. This game isn't even the most egregious example of this. But the idea to cover that one later has crossed my mind. Modern members of the community know that Christian Faber had a literal brainchild with some concepts like the Toa coming in to save the Great Spirit from his sleep. But Bob Thompson was the one that established the foundations for what made the character so impactful and timeless. After he left in 2005, the team did a moderately good job at keeping consistency with the story for the remaining 5 years of Generation 1. I would love to talk in the future too about what tweaks I'd make to the story so Generation 1 has a bit of a better narrative, but I'll get my main point across here. Bob's vision of the story was clearly one that surpassed anything else LEGO had attempted before this, sort of in the same vein to James Cameron's Avatar, where the simplicity on the surface level is a good hook to ease you into this world that has more of a spiritual connection to us as individuals. So, even if you were to take in the story of the universe from the smallest example of the released media, you'd still be able to feel the bond to the story. This game was one of the first times where that connection seemed to diminish. I remember it had almost turned me off to the line completely, but seeing a trailer for the movie Bionicle 2 Legends of Metro Nui the following year rekindled it for me, and the rest is history. Bionicle the game is one of those relics where I can appreciate its roots and the initial intentions, but I can also see how time can absolutely eviscerate that. If there's one message I'd want to pass along with this whole experience, it would be this. If you're a lead developer on a video game right now, especially if it's a AAA title or an EA intellectual property, take your time. Just do it. Don't tell yourself, oh, we can just patch it after initial reactions. That's lazy and obviously short-sighted. If you have any say in the matter, establish a reasonable and achievable deadline, and make sure you can find your name in those credits when it comes out.